Do you believe that the election of Donald Trump will lead to an undermined democracy?
So that's an interesting question, because the implication is that there's something gone wrong with democracy because Donald Trump is the president. Similar things have been argued in relation to the vote for Brexit, and some of the discussion here has kind of hinted at that, right? Is there a problem with democracy when the voters don't do what you want them to and vote the wrong way, is the implication. So I declare now that I campaigned for and voted for Brexit, which is, of course, enough to get me driven out of the church. I was a left-wing Brexit campaigner, for those of you who might know whatever that code might mean, in the spirit of Tony Benn. And I have found constantly, when I say that I'm Brexit, that people will say, oh, so you must be a racist xenophobe who thinks this, this, and this, which is very annoying. And that also, people will say, well, this terrible error happened, which we had a referendum and everybody voted the wrong way. Then, however, we then look at Trump, and then you think, oh, well, if that's what happens when you kind of let people away with voting, and people are genuinely now saying there's a problem with democracy. So in the midst of this youth discussion, I think it's worth reflecting on trust in politics, democracy, and so on and so forth.
That what happened with Gore and Bush, where Gore had the popular vote, but Bush was stopping black ethnic minorities from voting. He was stopping people that technically didn't live in America. So that as long as we have some form of the American idea of the electoral college, and it's not one person, one vote, then America as a whole is not going to be a democracy. So it shows that Trump didn't win because the people wanted him to win. Trump won because businessmen wanted him to win. And the oligarchs at the top 1% wanted Trump to win, not the bottom 99%.
What I wanted to say is that regarding the current state of democracy, we look at the elections and referendum, and they're considered to be necessarily democratic, but looking at the definition of democracy, it's what the people want. But in these elections, we see false promises, especially from, and I know you're not going to like this, the Leave campaign during the Brexit. They rode around on the battle bus, which said they were going to offer $350 million a week to the NHS after leaving the European Union. And that was nothing more than a lie. I mean, and we see that multiple instances of that happening with multiple political parties in multiple countries. Trump lied, the Leave Party lied. So how can we say that this system is necessarily working if the people aren't getting what they want?
Can I ask you? Can I ask you all, which is because you're all smart and you manage to see through those lies? Do you think that? What do you think the electorate are like then? Do you think that they're not as bright as you? What I mean is, how do you think people work through, based on the fact that you've said historically there's lots of lying going on in politics, but people, should we just abandon? I'm just not sure how you would deal with that. Go on, answer back, and then I'll take a couple more, and then I'll come back to the panel.
In terms of a solution to this issue, there needs to be more accountability to these people. Boris Johnson, Trump, and all these people need to have more forms of effectively punishment for this, and other forms of politics in other countries as well.
Okay, thank you.
We're discussing a lot of lies and deceit in politics, but I think Trump probably won because he was mainly the most honest man in American politics at that time. I mean, he was quite honest about his views, his misogyny, that I don't agree with, his racism. He's a bit of a nutcase, but my point is he was pretty honest to the media, he was pretty honest to the American people, and maybe that's what American people want, is honesty instead of lies and deceit that came from Hillary.
Very good point, thank you.
I think in regards, what is being ignored by the liberal left is that they are alienating the working class essentially from having their own view. And there is a nauseating sense of entitlement and elitism with the liberal left, assuming that the electorate is not able to think for themselves and pushing neoliberal policies. I think the real issue in regards to Trump is that Congress, the halls of Congress, the Senate, is essentially a revolving door of corporate influence. The only association that has won an election every time in the last 20 years is Goldman Sachs. Their influence is unwavering, and I think that Trump addressed this, whereas Hillary sort of mollycoddled Goldman Sachs. So I think that we should really take into account who is really in charge of political foundations.
Just to say about Trump and Hillary, I personally think that Hillary was a better candidate than Donald Trump because Donald Trump manipulated the lower population during the election, and you can continuously see how his attitudes, how his misogyny, and how his sexism has been allowed within America. And I feel like that if a great power like America can allow these actions to happen without any consequences, couldn't this happen in Britain without any consequences, any second glances as well?
There's some really, really interesting points made. I'll just make a couple of reflections from my personal experience. One is that I was sent to Trump's inauguration as a Conservative Party representative. I found his speech really, really difficult to sit through. But I did find it very interesting because I was surrounded by his supporters because they were the people who were at the inauguration and you had time to speak to them. And talking to people who supported them because, as I think Abigail said, they felt they had not been heard through successive presidencies, that nobody had been expressing the voice of Middle America, of these areas where the jobs had gone and there seemed to be no prospects. They felt they were heard, and it is really, really important for them to be heard through a political system, because if you don't get people's voices heard through peaceful means, they'll find non-peaceful means of protesting, and you'll get revolution and civil war and all those things that have far worse consequences than what may be a democratically elected presidency which has some bumps on the road, so to speak. So I think it's better for people's voices to be heard, even though democracy has its imperfections.
I think democracy, for all its faults, is, in comparison, the best system we have of governance in the world, compared to dictatorships and the like. We still have something that we should cherish and protect and ensure that systems are put in place which will ensure that the choice of the people is what will be achieved. But at the same time, I also feel very troubled by how democracy is chosen by democratic countries for other countries in the third world, in the developing world, and where we support democratic systems only when they suit our agenda and dismiss them when it is not in our interests. Many years ago, we had a democratically elected party which was leaning to Islam in Algeria. It was not good for us. We did not support that process, although it was monitored by independent people. We look at the occupied territories where Hamas was voted democratically. It is a proscribed terrorist organization. And so we felt, despite being democratically elected, we cannot support that. If you look at Egypt, where Muslim Brotherhood came to power through a democratically elected system, monitored by international monitors, it was not to our taste. We allowed a military coup to take place and a military dictator to take office and power. So if democracy is good for us, because the people have spoken, why is it not good for other nations where their people have spoken?
This is to the Conservative MP. So you speak about getting young people involved, but it's ironic because you talk about after the education system and when they're on the housing ladder, but what about before they're on the housing ladder? What about uni fees? Let's talk about uni fees. What about young people on climate change? There seems to be a lack of action on the issue of climate change. There doesn't seem to be serious action. And now, what about the young people in the increase in involvement from young people? You speak about it, but you don't like to talk about and give credit to Jeremy Corbyn on that. You talk about Brexit, but what about Jeremy Corbyn? What about his involvement?
It's worth bearing in mind that the one thing that Jeremy Corbyn and I have agreed on for 30 years, the only thing that Jeremy Corbyn and I have agreed on in many instances, was Brexit. So it's so ironic. Jeremy Corbyn campaigned to get out of the EU on every single occasion I heard him speak until he was party leader, just as an aside, but it's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say how it's very interesting how we're talking about right-wing biases and right-wing lies, but we're not talking about left-wing biases and lies in the media and campaigns. For example, as a Leave supporter, I really do hate that the Leave campaign ran on 350 million a week, but yet we don't talk about how the Remain side said that if we do vote Brexit, then the economy is just going to completely collapse, and that hasn't happened yet. We were told that it would happen when the vote happened, and it didn't happen. We were told when it would happen when Article 50 was triggered, and it hasn't happened yet. So why do we always focus on right-wing biases when the left did the same thing as well?
Thank you very much.
Personally, in regards to young people, I feel like politicians don't care and that they are self-interested. And the only reasons why the Conservatives are making it a big issue to advertise to the young people is because of the work that Jeremy Corbyn has done for the Labour Party and the way they stood up for him and risen up. And if not for that, they would have never considered young people. And the voting age should be decreased so 16-year-olds can vote, because 16-year-olds can join the army, they can do so much things, they can work. And if I'm paying tax, I should be able to influence the decisions that are made in my country. If not, it's not the true democracy.
Okay, so I just wanted to make things even more complicated, because I think that, whilst I agree with a lot of what you say, Ibrahim, I think we have to also acknowledge the problem is that sometimes there can be democratically elected governments who destroy human rights. And I suppose I have to speak there as the director of the Jewish Museum, that Hitler did get in, it's not beautifully democratic, but he certainly got the majority of vote and led to the destruction, his election, of 6 million, of 80% of European Jewry. Just in Poland alone, 3.8 million Jews were murdered. And so I think it's slightly disingenuous. It's not always straightforward to just say, let's support everyone who's democratically elected. And some of the people you talked about have terrible records on women, on gay rights, on other minorities. And I'm not saying I've got the answer, but I don't think it's straightforward. And I think we have to talk about the rule of law and human rights and basic standards that everyone adheres to, over and which above elected politicians cannot trample, because otherwise some of those governments that would bring in would be really horrific things for women, for gays and other minorities and religions that aren't part of Islamic, the Muslim Brotherhood.
And so one of the real challenges of democracy is not just to see it as going in once every 5 years, putting your X in a box, but actually getting more involved, getting your voices heard to your MP. I don't know if you guys know who your MPs are, but go and find out tonight if you don't, and find them on Twitter, find their email addresses, and let them know your views. And run for local democracy as well. My partner ran for the council, and there were so many young people in Luton who were beginning to get their heads around the fact that they could be local councillors, that you can get involved in your local democracy and make a difference in your area and your city and actually have a huge impact on some really nitty-gritty stuff.
I'm just thinking of the motivation of MPs, and one of the questions was about that. Any of you who are tempted of maybe standing for election, what's tempting you? Why do you think it might be a good idea to do it? Are you motivated by your self-interest? I bet you're not. I bet the thing that's making you think maybe you might want to stand for Parliament or stand for election at some level is because you want to make things better for other people around you, for the community that you're part of, for the country you live in. That's the motivation for all the MPs that I'm close to, that I work with, that makes me tick. The motivation is about making things better. That's what makes us tick. I'll say one other thing, which is I am happy to talk about Jeremy Corbyn. As Claire said, Jeremy was committed to Brexit. I was on the Remain side. I recognise now that we've had the referendum result, we're leaving the European Union, and the important thing now is to do a good job of leaving it. But I do think with Jeremy Corbyn, that he'd put his weight behind Remain, maybe the referendum result would have been different. So I'm quite happy to talk about him and his role in that. But I will say, to be clear, the referendum result was what it was, and we've got to make a good job of it now.